Welcome to Special Education Rights Part 1. Today we will be taking a page-by-page look at the first half of the Procedural Safeguards packet that you receive at every IEP meeting. I really like this presentation and you all deserve a virtual award for being here. I admit that I never read through the Procedural Safeguards before I came to work at Matrix, despite receiving many copies over the years. This packet contains important information about you and your child's special education rights and protections. Before we go into the presentation, I want to let you know that we're recording this today to share later on our website. And you do not have a copy of this PowerPoint because it is mostly images, and the information that we're going to be talking about is in the Procedural Safeguards document. So, and since we're recording this, you will be able to listen again if you like. Some of you may know about Matrix already. If not, I want to let you know that we strive to empower families with children who have special needs to navigate the various systems that are there to serve them. Please keep in mind that we are neither attorneys nor advocates. We're here to help you develop your advocacy skills, and being educated and informed is one of the strategies that you can use to advocate for your child. My name is Erica, and I am one of the parent advisors at Matrix. You will also be hearing from Margaret Johnston, who's been with Matrix for 9 years and is our senior parent advisor. What you will hopefully leave here knowing. In this presentation, we'll be going through the procedural safeguards in an effort to demystify this handout that you will receive if your child is being considered for special education or already has an IEP. We hope that you'll leave here knowing what procedural safeguards are and when they might be used, the 6 core principles of special education, what the following terms mean: parent participation, prior written notice, parent consent, non-discriminatory assessment, independent educational assessments, and access to records. All of this will help you to be a more informed member of your child's IEP team. So, what is the notice of procedural safeguards? This section talks about what the procedural safeguards is and when you will receive a copy. The notice of procedural safeguards is an overview of educational rights. These rights apply to students with disabilities aged 3 to 21 years, right up until just before their 22nd birthday. The procedural safeguards are required under IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And they must be provided to you under a number of circumstances. If you ask for a copy, the first time your child is referred for a special education assessment, every time you sign an assessment plan, if there is a change in placement, and these are actually the minimum requirements, you may end up getting a copy of the notice of procedural safeguards at every IEP meeting. You can also find them on the California Department of Education website. So all this to say that the message is it's not hard to find or to get the procedural safeguards. It is harder to understand them. So this next section is about the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This section talks about this federal law that establishes special education. There are 6 core principles of IDEA, and we'll go through them here and then continue into them more. So the 6 core principles of IDEA are a free and appropriate public education, parent-student participation in decisions, appropriate evaluation, the individualized education plan or program, the least restrictive environment, and the procedural safeguards. We'll be discussing these principles as they are presented in the procedural safeguards. The presentation today covers free appropriate public education, which is also sometimes called FAPE, referred to as FAPE. We'll be going over that. parent-student participation, and appropriate evaluation. We'll stay on this section to say a little bit more about FAPE. What is FAPE? FAPE is a free, appropriate public education. Unfortunately, it is not a free, best private education. The free and public are pretty clear, but the other terms leave more room for interpretation. Within FAPE, appropriate means meeting your child's unique needs. And within FAPE, education means academics and more than academics. It includes functional or everyday living skills. Education is the whole experience of school, including things like social interactions, group projects, field trips, and assemblies. The offer of FAPE is the special education and related services that your child receives that are described in the Individualized Education Plan, or the IEP. A free, appropriate public education gives the student access to the general education curriculum, either with accommodations, modifications, and or specialized programming to address the unique needs of the individual related to their disability and to education. A free, appropriate public education, a FAPE, is intended to support the student to make more than trivial progress. They should be supported to make appropriate progress. And if you would like to understand more about this distinction, you can refer to the Enders F case, and we have a help sheet on the Enders F case. Enders F was a Supreme Court case decided in 2017 that says that IEPs must give kids with disabilities more than minimal educational benefit. So this case raised the bar from minimal to more than minimal benefit. We are moving on to the section called, May I Participate in Decisions About My Child's Education? The first paragraph of this section explains how parents can participate. Parents are members of the IEP team, and as members of the IEP team and as parents, you have the right to attend and participate in meetings where decisions are made about many things, about eligibility, assessment, placement, related services. The school district must attempt to find a mutually agreed upon time, and they must document their attempts to find a mutually agreed upon IEP meeting time and place. And this being said, IEP meetings can be difficult to schedule. So if you can, try to accept the proposed time, but certainly ask for a change if you need to. Students may also attend IEP meetings, and this can really foster the development of self-advocacy. Younger ones might just come in for a little bit, maybe introduce themselves, say one thing they like about school, and the students' participation can then increase with age. They must have input on their ITP, which is their individual transition plan. This starts best practice at age 14 and by law at age 16. So at age 16, students must be invited to the IEP meeting. They don't have to attend, but they must be invited. And some parents are surprised by this idea of having their child attend an IEP meeting. And they may be skeptical, but actually it generally tends to be a good experience. The students can feel very proud that everyone at the meeting is there for them. They may not stay for the whole thing, but they may, want to add something while they're there, have input, and their presence can really contribute to a positive environment of the meeting. Another way that that children and young people can participate is to share ideas about what they think might help. So they might make a list for you to bring, or bring a list to that you've maybe helped them with, but are their ideas, or they may just want to come or be able to come to the IEP meeting and just say what they think would be helpful. And you might be surprised, or it can be surprising how willing the team may be to accommodate the requests that come directly from the student. So moving on, this section also says that parents must receive written progress reports on their students' IEP goals as often as general education students receive report cards. So this is not the same as a report card. This is an additional thing, which is progress on goals. This is often 3 times a year, and you can look back at a previous IEP and look at the goals to see the 3 sets of progress reports that are written in under the goals. The second paragraph here talks about recording IEP meetings. And it says that with given 24-hour notice, an IEP meeting can be recorded electronically, either by the parent or the district. If the district wants to record and the parent doesn't give consent, then they can't record it. And if the parent requests to record, then the district will record as well, most likely. The third paragraph talks about getting information on the options that were considered. And it states that your decision-making rights include getting information on the availability of free appropriate public education, including all the program options that were considered, even those that were not ultimately decided on. So now we are going to the section called Where Can I Get More Help? The first paragraph here talks about what you can do if you have concerns about your child's education. If you have concerns, start closest to home or closest to the problem first. So if there's a problem in the classroom, your first step would be to contact your child's teacher. If you need to go beyond that, then you would contact the principal, program manager, or special education director, depending on the structure of your school. Going beyond that level, you might contact the SELPA, which is the Special Education Local Plan Area, the SELPA, which oversees special education in your area. For example, Sonoma SELPA, Sonoma Charter SELPA, Marin SELPA. Every school has to belong to a SELPA. The second paragraph here talks about parent support, and IDEA actually mandates that each state have at least one parent training and information center to support parents to participate in and be informed members of their child's IEP. PTIs, parent training and information centers, were developed to increase collaboration between parents and educators, and therefore to improve special education. Matrix is the PTI for the counties of Marin, Napa, Solano, and Sonoma, and now many other Northern California counties as well. Still on this same page, the next section is, what if my child is deaf, hard of hearing, blind, visually impaired, or deafblind? Now, many of these students attend local schools, but the state does have 3 specialized facilities to serve these students with residential and day programs. And if you would like more information about these schools, you can visit the California Department of Education website. The page is State Special Schools that you would look at, or you can ask for more information from your child's IEP team. Moving down to the next section, we're starting to talk about prior written notice. The first part is prior written notice, when is it needed? First of all, what is prior written notice? It is a written notice given by the district to the parents before any change, good or bad, can happen. This must be given when the district proposes to initiate a change, or if they are refusing to initiate a change that the parent has asked for. Any written notice needs to be given in a way that is understandable and in the parent's native language or mode of communication, unless it is clearly not feasible to do so. When is prior written notice most often seen? It's most often seen in connection with denying a request for assessment. So a specific example of prior written notice is the requirement that schools respond to a parent's request for an initial assessment or an assessment at any time, that the district should give you either prior written notice if they're denying the assessment, or an assessment plan if they are agreeing to assess. And they need to do this, in this case, within 15 calendar days of your written request for assessment. Some other examples of circumstances that require prior written notice are changes to the student's special education eligibility category, changes in placement. For example, if a parent writes to contest a placement and is asking for a change of placement, the parent must be given prior written notice to either agree to agree to the change in placement or deny the change in placement. Another circumstance would be any change to the provision of FAPE, the provision of the free appropriate public education. And that is that formal offer that has been made by the district about placement and related services. The prior written notice must state, in addition to what the change is or what they're denying, they must state the reason for the district's position and include the data that was used to make that decision. And the next section goes into more details on this. Now we're on the section called "What Will the Notice Tell Me?" Prior written notice must include a description of what's being proposed or refused. It must include the reason why it's being proposed or refused, and a description of the data that was used by the district. Basically, what was the information that the district based either their proposal or their refusal on? It also must include language about the parent's protection under procedural safeguards, resources for help with understanding the prior written notice, a description of other options that the team considered and the reasons those options are ultimately not being done, and a description of anything else related to what's being proposed or refused. And if you're told any of these things verbally, you can certainly ask for it in writing. And now we're going to move on to parental consent, and I'm going to hand it over to Margaret.
So there are many points in the whole process where you're going to be asked to consent to something. And so we're going to the section called Parental Consent. It's on, in my version, it's on page 3, about a third of the way down, and it'll continue on through page 4. So basically, when are you required to give consent or asked to give consent? It's when there's an evaluation, when there's a question about eligibility, and when there are changes to the program, include changes in placement particularly, or changes to the accommodations, the modifications, whatever they're changing in the IEP. And so, as we've discussed a couple of slides ago, the district has 15 calendar days after receiving parental written consent to request, parental written request for evaluation, to let the parent know in writing if an assessment is going to be done. And then you have 15 days from when you receive an assessment plan to decide whether you're going to sign it and go ahead with it. More likely than not, you as a parent had initiated the request for assessment. So the sooner you sign it and send it back, the sooner the clock's going to start ticking, and the assessment in the IEP meeting will have to be held. So this assessment timeline is 15 days for the district to respond, 15 days for the parent to sign the assessment plan, and 60 days to perform the assessments is in the law, and it provides some protection for you so they can't take forever to get these things done. We have there are other timelines that are written into the law, and we have a timeline help sheet. It should have been provided to you with your Zoom link. If not, again, you can find it on our webpage, or if you can't find it on our webpage, you can give us a call and we'll lead you to that. Um, so there's other situations where the district might want to ask for assessment rather than the parent, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So when is my approval as a parent required for giving services? And the answer is pretty much all of the time. The parent is supposed to be able to give informed consent. So it's both informed and written consent. And so what does it mean to say informed written consent? And first of all, it means that you have been fully informed um, in either your native language or other mode of communication, and unless it's clearly not feasible to do so, as to what it is you're agreeing to, so that you really understand what you're agreeing to, and that you have understood and signed a document indicating that you understand, and further, that you understand that your consent is voluntary, and that you know that you can withdraw your consent or change your mind at any time. So the parent has to give informed written consent by signing in agreement on the IEP before your child can receive any kind of special ed or related services. So this is why at an IEP meeting, you're generally handed the IEP document and asked to sign it at that point. One of the things parents sometimes don't realize is it's not just take it or leave it. You can sign to agree to part of it and not all of it. And you can agree to some of the services and not all of the services. You can sign saying you agree to the services they're providing, but you think more services are needed. So in whatever you agree to, you should sign an agreement to that, but you should make note of whatever you don't consent to. But it's important that if you want special ed to go forward, that you consent to those things that you want to go forward. And at this point, I think we'll go on to the next slide. So what happens if you don't provide consent? And, unfortunately, we've talked to parents who sometimes really have, gone through 2 years and don't have a signed IEP, and the school is just continuing to implement the old IEP, and this situation just goes on and on. This is really not a good thing, because it makes both the parent and puts both the parent and the school district in a bad situation legally if that sort of thing goes on. So you really do need to have, at some point, you have to have a signed document. And this is a situation where if the school has made what they call the offer of FAPE, and that's all the service, the placement and all the services and all the modifications and accommodations, and they've presented this to you and said, this is what we believe is FAPE. This is what we believe is free appropriate education for your child. And you say, well, I want part of those and not others. At that point, if you can't at some point agree, the school district really should take you to due process to enforce their offer. Because if they don't think they can provide your child with free appropriate education without providing all those services, then then that's what they're supposed to be doing. So it is possible, this is not very common, but it is possible for the district to take you to due process to enforce their offer of FAPE. So if you decide you don't want special education at all, you can just not consent to any of it, and the district cannot force you to put your child in special ed. So if you just don't want any of it, it's fine for you to say, I don't know if I should say it's fine, but it is certainly legally acceptable for you to say no to the entire thing. I don't want special education services. If that's the case, then you're losing the protections that are provided through special ed, including protections around behavior, discipline, attendance, and other issues that you may have, and your child would just be treated like any other child, given the same kind of disciplinary actions, be subject to expulsion and that sort of thing in the same way that any other child not in special ed would have. So, um, so that's something that you can do if you want to. We wouldn't recommend it, but it is something that you have to be aware of, that you can decide not to have any special ed services. That is your right. If you didn't agree to everything and you agreed to part of it, then the school district is supposed to start those services. The term is without delay. I don't think there's a time limit about what it means without delay, but they're supposed to go forward as quickly as they can to provide those services. And then, if you have not agreed to some of them, then the district should take you to due process to make sure your child gets all the services they think they need. And I've gone over this a little bit, but if they really think your child needs these services, then they need to do something to resolve that dispute. There are other ways to resolve the dispute. You should be having another IEP meeting, more discussion, maybe going through an alternative dispute resolution or mediation with the district, using the services of the SELPA. But if you really just get to a point where you're saying, I want speech and I don't want OT or something like that, the district really should take you to due process to resolve that. And so that's basically the situation that should occur. Unfortunately, as I said, often that doesn't occur, and time just goes on, and the disagreement is just left there on the table. But we have heard of a court case where this went on for several years, and the parent never consented to the whole IEP, and the district wasn't providing services because the parent hadn't agreed to them, even though it had been in their offer. And when this finally came to court, the court said to the district, well, you should have resolved this, and since you didn't, you are liable for compensatory services for 2 years because you didn't do anything to resolve this, and you said the child needed them. So it puts the district at jeopardy if they just leave these disputes unresolved. So there is one time when the district can, usually, as we've said, if you want an assessment, usually you're the one asking, and the district has to get your written consent to do the assessment. There is one situation where the district can do an assessment without your consent, and that is if your child already has an IEP and the district wants to reassess for whatever reason, and the district has documented reasonable measures to obtain your consent, meaning it has to show they've tried to reach out to you, they've tried to get you to sign an assessment plan, and give your consent. But if you fail to respond, then the district can reassess your child without your consent. This can be an issue if the district wants to exit your child from special education. And if they ask to exit your child from special ed, they really should be performing an assessment as proof that your student no longer needs the services in the IEP. And the parent doesn't want the student to be exited. And in this case, the district does not have to wait for the parent to consent in order to do that kind of reassessment. So that's just something to be aware of. So failing to sign in that situation does not prevent them from going ahead with a reassessment. And we'll go on to the next slide. So the next question is, when can I revoke consent? What happens if you've given your consent and then you decide at some point you don't want to do that, and that consent was not what you meant, or the situation should change and you want to revoke your consent. So we're now at the top of page 4 of your notice of procedural safeguards. And so if you revoke your consent, you have to do it in writing at any time after this is started, at any time after kid has started getting services. If you want to revoke your consent, do it in writing. And then what happens? So the district has to provide prior written notice before they stop services, and then they stop services. And they're not allowed to use mediation or due process or any other means to sort of bully you into not doing that. If you decide to do that, they're not supposed to prevent you from making that decision. But then, then they're not in violation of FAPE. They're not required to have an IEP meeting. They're not required to amend the child's record. They just stop services at that point. So that's what can happen. If you decide at some point in the future to just revoke your consent to all of the special ed services they're offering. That doesn't happen very often, but you have to be aware that it is your right to do. And then we'll go on to the next slide. And so what happens if a parent can't be identified or located? And so this isn't your case, but there must be a surrogate parent appointed for that situation. This happens primarily when foster children are getting special ed services. And so the district has to appoint somebody to act as the parent in that situation, because this whole process of special ed is set up for parental participation. It doesn't work without parental participation at some level. And so they have to provide someone who's acting in that capacity. So then we're going to get into into assessment. And what is a non-discriminatory assessment? How is my child assessed for special education? And I need to get my notes, get my version up here to the notes page here. So you do have certain rights around assessment. So anything that they use to assess your child has to be non-discriminatory. It can't be racially, culturally, gender biased. It has to be something that has been demonstrated to be non-discriminatory. And you have the right to have your child assessed in all areas of suspected disability. So if the district says we want to do a speech eval and some other test, and you say, but what about social and emotional? What about, is this going to uncover learning disabilities? You have the right to tell them that you suspect an area of disability, and if there's any evidence at all that there is a reason to suspect an area of disability, they have to assess in that area. The assessments have to be done by a qualified professional, and they have to use a variety of procedures, methods, a variety of tests. They can't use one single test to determine eligibility. And that includes, when they're doing the assessment, it has to include whatever information that you provide to them as well. So if you write down your observations, those observations become data that's part of the assessment. The assessment material and the assessments themselves should be given in your child's native language or mode of communication. When they say mode of communication, if your child is deaf or hard of hearing, if your child is autistic and nonverbal, they need to find testing methods in which they can actually communicate in a way the child can understand. And it has to be done in a way that most likely leads to a clear result on what the child's capabilities are. And again, it says, unless clearly not feasible to do so, and doesn't define what that means. But it means they have to try very hard to get accurate test results and to do it in the child's native language or mode of communication. And the information should be on what your child knows and what your child can do academically, developmentally, and functionally. So be aware that when you review the assessments, that it's supposed to cover all of those areas. Generally, the district conducts the assessment to determine eligibility and guide the development of the IEP. So there's two reasons for every assessment. The first is, does your kid fit into one of these 13 categories of eligibility for special ed? But the second and probably more important reason, once your child is actually in special ed, is to give the information needed so you can develop a sound IEP. The person who performs the assessment is supposed to be available at the IEP meeting to review the results and explain the results of the assessment. If that individual who actually conducted the assessment isn't available for any reason, they have to find somebody else who's equally qualified to give that, to explain the results of the assessment to you. So, if your school psychologist resigned or, got sick after they did the assessment, they have to find another school psychologist who can read and understand the assessment and explain it to you. We do have an assessment packet online, so if you have questions about the assessment process, you can get some more information about that. And the main thing is, if you read through your assessments, you should be asking yourself constantly, does this sound like my child? Does this make sense with what I know about my child? And if you read the assessment you get and it doesn't seem accurate to you for any reason, then you can ask for what's called an independent education evaluation. And I think that is when we go to the next slide. So now we're going to go on and talk about IEEs. And so what is an IEE? The term is Independent Educational Evaluation. And so once your district has completed their assessment of your child, and for whatever reason you don't think it's adequate or accurate, you don't agree with it, and you don't have to explain why you don't, but you can sign the IEP and say you disagree and you want an independent educational evaluation. Or actually, at any time within 2 years of when the district did the assessment, you can ask for an IEE at public expense. And it's important to say at public expense because you can always go get an independent assessment of your child if you pay for it. And they are quite expensive. So what you're really asking for is an IEE at public expense. You can only get one IEE for each time the district performs an assessment. But you can get one in every area they assessed. If they did cognitive testing and academic testing and speech therapy testing, you can get assessment in all of those areas through an independent educational evaluation. And once you've made that request, they have two options. The first is to respond to your request and provide you with information where you can get an IEE. They should have a list of people who do them, and then pay for it. Or their second choice is to proceed with due process to prove that the district's assessment is valid and appropriate. Now, a few years ago, we just told parents that if you request an IEE, they have to provide it, because that used to be the general practice. The school districts just figured it was too much trouble to file for due process, so they just went ahead and paid for IEEs when parents asked for them. More recently, there's been a couple of court cases that have said essentially that if the district can demonstrate that the person conducting the tests were qualified, that they did appropriate tests, well established tests, and all of the results were valid, that they can defend that assessment. And so it's become more common than it used to be for the district to go ahead and file for due process and say our assessment was valid. That isn't a reason not to request one if you think it's necessary, because it's up to them to prove that their assessment was valid. It's not up to you to prove it wasn't. So if if the district says, well, if you request this, we'll file for due process. You can say, well, fine, I'm still requesting, and then it's up to them to take action one way or the other. If they go to due process and the judge, the hearing officer, says, yes, the district's assessment was valid and they don't have to pay for an IEE, you can still get an IEE, but you would have to pay for it. Now, so what happens with that data? Whether they pay for it or whether you pay for it, they have to use that information they have to consider that information in developing the IEP. They're not required to follow every recommendation of a private assessor, but they have to consider the information. They have to demonstrate that they've read the assessments, they understand them, and that they are, considering that information in developing the IEP. So the next question is access to records. And at this point, I guess we should let you know where we are on the procedural safeguards document. So this, on my version, it's right in the middle of page 5. Access to educational records. Both federal and state law have provisions that you have access to to educational records, and it's California state law that says the districts have 5 calendar days to give you access to records. That's quicker than the federal law, but that's what holds in California. So you can ask for them orally in writing, but we always recommend that you ask in writing so you have a record of when you ask and what you ask for. It's too easy for someone to forget a verbal request or to claim later that it wasn't made. So put it in writing. It's very important for you to know what's in your student record, and it's always a good idea to have that information at any time, but particularly if they're leaving school, if they're graduating from high school or finishing a transition program, it's a good thing to go ahead and get copies of those records. They do keep those records for a long time, but it gets harder to find them if you don't ask for them at the time your kid is still in school. And also, the district is required to keep a log of who sees your child's file. There is a law called the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, or abbreviated FERPA, that protects confidentiality. So they cannot distribute those records to just anybody. There are requirements of privacy requirements, and basically qualified school personnel who work with your child can see the record. You can see the record. But if somebody else asked to see it, then they wouldn't necessarily be given access. And if you want to know who has seen your child's file, they should be able to tell you exactly who has seen that. They're supposed to document that. So that's another protection that's provided. So the next part of the procedural safeguards is how disputes are resolved. And that's really going to be the subject of our next training. That's a long discussion also about how you go about resolving a dispute once you've gotten to the point where you can't come to agreement with the district. So we're going to go over that more in the next presentation. And at this point, we'll just ask you to think about what you've learned, what you need in terms of more resources. Do you need more support? And we certainly invite you to make use of all the resources on our webpage, and we certainly invite you to give us a call at any time on the helpline, and we will do our best to get back in touch and have an individual discussion with you about whatever support you need. Basically, we have to remind you that we're parent advisors, we're not attorneys, and we're not paid advocates. So we don't view our job as telling you what to do. It's really to help you have the information you need and the support you need in order that you can be the best advocate for your child, because you're the one who's going to be doing it for years and years. And so the better you can get at understanding your rights, understanding the process, and doing the advocacy for your child yourself, um, this is the best outcome. Nations were what's considered a federal parent training and information center. That's a designation we get from the Office of Special Education, which is part of the U.S. Department of Education. And the slide says we serve Marin, Napa, Sonoma, and Solano counties, but just recently we've been assigned to also serve several more counties in Northern California. And we just haven't amended this slide to say what those counties are. But if there's any question, we can refer to that and look up which counties those are. We're also a California Family Resource Center, and that's a designation of the California Department of Developmental Services. So that's serving families of infants and toddlers with special needs. And then we're also considered a California Family Empowerment Center. Again, it's from the California Department of Education, and that's serving underserved communities in Solano and Sonoma counties. We get some money from the U.S. Department of Education and some money from the Office of Special Ed in the California Department of Education. And while that is great and we're grateful for that funding, it's not enough to provide all the services that we think are needed. And so we do rely on other grants, and we do rely on donations. And we do our best to keep all of our services free to parents, but we do also gratefully accept any donations. And we have a button on our website that allows you to donate if you are so moved.